Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, an ancient RPG series continues on the NES, a shooter gets a sequel, and real-time strategy on the Game Boy. Hi, I'm your host Jared, and today is January 6th, 1993. Kicking off the new year is the continuation of a beloved RPG series. Released this week for the NES is Ultima Warriors of Destiny. Ultima Warriors of Destiny continues the long-running Ultima series as an NES port. It's based on Ultima 5 of the same name. Lord British has gone missing and the mad tyrant Lord Blackthorn has taken his throne. Create your avatar, travel around town, talk to NPCs, get into random battles, and earn experience points to level up. Interestingly, even though it's a port, the NES version of Ultima 5 makes a bunch of changes, including overhauling the entire game. The original Ultima 5 for computers was released in 1988 and still used the same tile-based movement and perspective the entire series had used up to that point. Work on the NES version began in early 1991, and by then, Ultima 6, The False Prophet, was also already out on computers, featuring a completely new interface like an isometric view, more detailed characters, inventory screen, colors, and used an entirely new engine. Fearing that a straight port of Ultima 5 for the NES would already look antiquated compared to the new hotness of Ultima 6, developer Origin Systems decided to overhaul the entire game to have a graphical style resembling that of Ultima 6. It would have been easy to use the same old graphics the series has been using, so the developer truly took steps way beyond expectations. It's also why Ultima Warriors of Destiny on the NES is a technical disaster. The new graphics didn't agree with the NES hardware limitations, making the entire game play at a stilted, awful pace. The size of the game world had to be deformed and shrunk down just to fit in the cartridge, and you can't even name your avatar anymore, and it must be male. Numerous NPCs are missing, your maximum party size is 4 instead of 6, lots of dialogue and important plot elements were cut. Perhaps the most irritating of all is that after character creation is finished, there are 0 sound effects in the entire game and only 1 song plays the entire time. Now, in the 90s, the Ultima franchise was seen as the quintessential RPG series, in the same way that many people see the Final Fantasy series today. So an awful port like this was an embarrassment. We could only find a single review in all the gaming magazines at the time, and it was in Nintendo Power, who gave it a score of a 2.8 out of 5, which might be the lowest score I've seen Nintendo Power give anything yet. The Sega Genesis also got a sequel this week in January 1993 when it received Lightning Force: Quest for the Darkstar. Lightning Force, and yes, it is misspelled, is a horizontal 2D shooter where you shoot everything on screen that flies at you. Swap between 5 different weapons that you can power up whenever you want. You can also choose which stages you want to do in any order, and it also has some great graphics with lots of parallax scrolling alongside a sick soundtrack. Now, to some of you, Lightning Force is looking strangely familiar, and that's because you're correct. This is a port of Thunder Force 4. If you recall, in 1992, the SNES got a port of Thunder Force 3 called Thunder Spirits, and now the Genesis is getting a port of Thunder Force 4 called Lightning Force. And no, we have no idea why they can't just stick with one naming scheme. It was a decision made entirely by Sega of America. Interestingly, part of the team that developed Lightning Force is the same team that also developed the port of Devil's Crush for the Sega Genesis, that metal pinball game from the TurboGrafx. They used that experience to push the Lightning Force port beyond the quality of the previous Sega ports of the series. It's also why the game still has a bit of that metal soundtrack in it. Lightning Force: Quest for the Darkstar got a lot of critical acclaim at its release, and rightfully so. It was ported to the Sega Saturn in Japan only, and if you want to play it now, you can, thanks to the Nintendo eShop for the Nintendo Switch, where it's still under its original Genesis title of Lightning Force, complete with misspelling. An arcade classic goes portable, released this week in 1993, was Rampart for the Nintendo Game Boy. Rampart is based on the arcade game from Atari in 1990. Pick a castle, build some cannons, and then blow the crap out of your opponents. After battle, you're given about 30 seconds to rebuild your walls using random Tetris-like pieces. You can also use this as an opportunity to expand your territory larger for more points, capture additional castles, and then have space to build even more cannons. Gameplay of Rampart for the Game Boy is notably different than the arcade version, or even the excellent NES or SNES ports. The original style of Rampart was to blast away your opponent, often another player, and their walls. And if they couldn't rebuild the wall in the building phase, they would lose. Rather than making you do that for the Game Boy game, you instead blast away at CPU-controlled armies attacking you. Infantrymen, knights, those tower invasion things. Those were your moving targets instead of just some boring walls. In fact, many people consider Rampart to be the progenitor of tower defense games. I actually love Rampart. I played the heck out of the NES version as a kid, and I was surprised at how well it works for a Game Boy title. You can play it 2 players with a second copy and a link cable, but that's not gonna happen, so I'll just play the NES one instead. Were there any other games that released this week? We'll find out with editor Dylan.
Releasing on the Genesis the very first day in '93, what else? We got a sports game. Very fitting way to kick off the year. But Tecmo Super Bowl is not your typical run-of-the-mill football game. This is a sequel to one of the best football games on the NES, and is still widely considered as one of the best football games to this day. Hell, even I own a copy of the original, and I don't even have an NES anymore. Well, I do, but it won't fit. The Genesis and later released SNES versions would update visuals, audio, rosters, and fix minor bugs found in its NES counterpart. It's a pretty good time. But the same cannot be said for Family Dog on the SNES. The game is your standard platformer with that phoned-in licensed tie-in feel to it. You know the one. It functions alright, but I watched an episode of the show this game is based on, and it's just a bad time. The dog in Family Dog loves his family unconditionally and usually acts as dogs typically do. If that was the whole show, then it would be fine, but it's the family that sucks. They constantly neglect, berate, and straight up torture this dog who has the audacity to want a drink of water. I need to hug my cats real quick, stand by. This video is brought to you by Patreon. Go to the link in the description to have early access to videos, exclusive content, and more. And now back from snuggling with the cats. They were very confused. Released on the Game Boy this week was Top Gun: Guts to Glory. It's another game that proves the Game Boy can't handle the flight sim genre in first person. It just can't. It doesn't even have Tom Cruise. To be fair, no Tom Cruise movie-based video game has ever featured Tom Cruise, or even a Tom Cruise lookalike. Here's a few examples. Mission Impossible, not Tom Cruise. The Mummy Demastered, not Tom Cruise. Minority Report, that's a lot of not Tom Cruise. Okay, I swear, that was the last time I say Tom Cruise. Time Cruise is a pinball game for the TurboGrafx 16. It offers branching tables and some cool bonus rooms that try to shake up the gameplay, ranging from mini golf to a shoot 'em up to Marble Madness. The final game released this week was Buster Bros on the TurboGrafx CD. It's essentially the same as the SNES version, which we already covered on the Super Mario Land 2 episode of Now in the 90s. I totally didn't just look up the date, November 4th, 1992, which gives us a grand total of 9 games released on these 5 consoles this first week in 1993. For the sake of restoring some faith in humanity, if you have pets, do me a favor, give them some extra attention today. Maybe their favorite treat, some hugs, or some extra playtime. Just treat them well. They deserve it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go build an obstacle course for Batman and Cleo.
Thank you, Dylan. Ultima Warriors of Destiny is this week's biggest value gainer. A loose cartridge is now worth $112, and a complete in-box copy, which includes a map, is worth around $200. Lightning Force on the Sega is still respectable. A copy of the game is worth $60, and a complete one is about $115. Rampart has a pretty big gap between loose and complete. The game itself is only worth like $15, and a complete in-box copy shoots up to $140. But based on my research, that's because one dude spoofed his own eBay selling with an alternate account to jack up the complete price to $375 in 2017, and everyone followed suit. Thankfully, it's been coming down from that. And that's it for today. Next week, a platformer on the Sega CD, a cool mascot gets another brand video game, and a sports game that I'm covering, not Dylan. Woo! I'm your host, Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. I want to thank some patrons like Tom Perslin, Christina Rose, and Rushmore Miles. Please like the video and leave a comment down below and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you already are a subscriber, thank you so much. Like I said, I love the NES version of Rampart. I actually bought this when my local video game store was closing down, and I actually still have the video rental sticker still in the back. And I can't bring myself to remove it because, you know, it's like still having a piece of my childhood and a piece of home.